The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Thomas Whitmore's corner office on the 42nd floor, but he barely noticed its warmth anymore. At 58 years old he had built an empire from nothing, yet something felt missing from his carefully orchestrated life. His assistant Margaret knocked gently before entering with his morning coffee and schedule, but Thomas was already reaching for his chest, feeling a tightness that had been growing stronger each day. The boardroom meeting that afternoon was supposed to seal his biggest acquisition yet, but halfway through his presentation the room began to spin. The mahogany table seemed to tilt and the concerned faces of his colleagues blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Thomas felt himself falling, and then everything went black. When consciousness slowly returned he found himself not in the sterile white walls of City General where his insurance would have taken him, but in a small rural clinic somewhere outside town. The ambulance driver had made a judgment call when Thomas collapsed on the sidewalk outside the corporate building, choosing the nearest medical facility over the prestigious hospital across the city. The room smelled of lavender and antiseptic mixed together in a way that somehow felt comforting rather than clinical. Soft afternoon light streamed through gingham curtains and Thomas could hear the gentle murmur of voices in the hallway. This was nothing like the hospitals he knew, with their harsh fluorescent lighting and constant electronic beeping. A woman in simple blue scrubs entered the room carrying a clipboard and wearing a warm smile that reached her eyes. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there was something instantly calming about her presence. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades caring for others. "Good afternoon," she said softly, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "I'm Helen Morrison and I'll be taking care of you today. How are you feeling?" Thomas studied her face, searching for any sign of recognition, but found none. No widening of eyes, no sudden change in demeanor that usually accompanied people learning his identity. Here was someone who simply saw him as another patient in need of care. "I've been better," he admitted, surprised by how easily the honesty came. "Where exactly am I?" "Pine Valley Community Clinic," Helen replied, checking his blood pressure with gentle efficiency. "You gave everyone quite a scare. Dr. Matthews wants to keep you overnight for observation. Your heart rhythm was irregular and we want to make sure everything stabilizes." As the hours passed, Thomas found himself looking forward to Helen's visits every few hours. She would check his vitals, adjust his pillows, and somehow always knew exactly what to say. When he mentioned feeling restless, she brought him a worn copy of Robert Frost poems. When he complained about the bland hospital food, she smuggled in homemade soup from the clinic's small kitchen. "Tell me about this place," Thomas asked during one of her evening rounds. "How long have you worked here?" Helen settled into the chair beside his bed as if she had all the time in the world. 23 years come October," she said with quiet pride. "Started here fresh out of nursing school when my husband Frank got a job at the grain elevator. Pine Valley needed nurses and I needed to help people. Seemed like a perfect match." "And your husband?" Thomas asked gently, sensing there was more to the story. "Lost him to cancer 5 years ago," Helen replied without self-pity. "Frank always said this town raised us well and we owed it our service. I stayed because these people still need someone who cares about them, not just their insurance coverage or ability to pay." Something in her words struck deep in Thomas's chest, deeper than any physical pain he had felt. Here was someone who had found meaning in service while he had spent decades accumulating wealth and power that suddenly felt hollow by comparison. Over the next day Helen shared stories of the clinic's patients. There was old Mr. Patterson, who paid his bills with fresh vegetables from his garden. Mrs. Chen, who knitted scarves for every new baby born at the clinic. The Henderson family, who drove 50 miles each way because they trusted Helen more than any big city doctor. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Thomas asked, finally unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Helen looked at him with those kind eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Should I?" she asked simply. "You're Thomas, a man who works too hard and doesn't take good enough care of himself. You're someone's son, probably someone's father, and right now you're my patient. That's all I need to know." Her words hit him like a revelation. When was the last time someone had seen him simply as Thomas, not as the CEO or the millionaire or the man whose approval could make or break careers? When had he last felt valued for who he was rather than what he owned? On his final morning at the clinic, Thomas felt reluctant to leave. Helen was preparing his discharge papers when he made a decision that surprised even himself. "Helen," he said quietly, "what would it take to keep this clinic running for another 20 years? She looked up from her paperwork, confusion crossing her features. "I'm sorry, the building, the equipment, the staff, salaries. What would it cost to ensure this place never has to worry about money again?" Helen set down her pen, studying his face carefully. "Thomas, what are you really asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd let me help," he said simply. "Not as some wealthy benefactor looking for a tax write-off, but as someone who has learned more about life in 2 days here than in 20 years of board meetings." It took several conversations and a great deal of gentle persuasion, but eventually Helen agreed to let Thomas establish a foundation to support the clinic, not because she was impressed by his wealth but because she could see the genuine desire to contribute something meaningful to the world. Over the following months, Thomas found himself making regular trips to Pine Valley. Ostensibly he came to check on the foundation's projects, but in truth he came to see Helen. Their friendship deepened slowly, naturally, like the changing of seasons. They would take long walks through the town's quiet streets, talking about everything and nothing. Helen shared her wisdom about finding joy in simple moments, while Thomas discovered he had stories worth telling that had nothing to do with business deals or profit margins. "You know," Helen said one evening as they sat on the clinic's front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pastels, "when you first arrived I thought you were just another stressed businessman headed for a heart attack. I never imagined you'd become such a good friend." Thomas reached for her hand, feeling a contentment he had never known existed. "I never imagined a collapsed blood vessel would lead me to the most important thing I'd ever found." "Which is?" Helen asked with that gentle smile he had grown to love. "Home," Thomas replied simply. "I found my way home." In the months that followed, Thomas gradually stepped back from his corporate responsibilities, delegating more and eventually selling his company to executives who shared his newfound values about work-life balance. He bought a small house on Maple Street 3 blocks from the clinic and discovered the joy of being a regular at Murphy's Diner and the weekly church potluck. Helen and Thomas were married the following spring in a simple ceremony at the Pine Valley Community Church. The reception was held in the clinic's parking lot with tables borrowed from the school and food prepared by half the town. Thomas had never felt richer. They spent their honeymoon not in some exotic location but camping in the state park where Helen had gone as a child with her parents. Thomas learned to fish properly for the first time in his life, and Helen taught him to identify bird calls at dawn. "Do you ever miss it?" Helen asked one evening as they sat by their small campfire. "The excitement, the power, the fast pace of your old life?" Thomas considered the question seriously, as he had learned to do with all of Helen's gentle inquiries. "I miss the feeling of being important," he said honestly, "but I've learned there's a difference between being important and being significant. Here with you doing work that actually matters to people, I feel significant for the first time in my life." Years passed peacefully in Pine Valley. Thomas became known not as the wealthy newcomer but as Helen's husband, the man who could fix anything mechanical and always had time to help neighbors with projects. The foundation he established grew to support not just the clinic but the library, the school, and various community programs. But more than any financial contribution, Thomas discovered his greatest gift was simply showing up. He was there when Mrs. Patterson needed help moving furniture after her husband passed. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings and read to children at the library story hour. "You saved my life," he told Helen one evening as they worked together in their small garden behind the house. "The doctors at the clinic saved your life," Helen corrected gently, as she always did when he became too dramatic. "No," Thomas said, standing up and brushing soil from his hands. "You showed me what it means to live. There's a difference." Helen smiled, that warm knowing smile that had first captured his heart. "Well then I guess we saved each other," she said simply, "because you showed me it's never too late for new adventures even at our age." As Thomas looked around their simple life, their small garden, their modest home filled with laughter and purpose, he knew she was right. Sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in what we accumulate but in what we're willing to leave behind for something infinitely more valuable. Sometimes love finds us exactly when we stop looking for it in all the wrong places and start being the person worthy of finding it at all.